Hi, this is Jesse Morrison, and I'm here to do my informative speech with my audience. So I appreciate you guys letting me come out here to talk to you about how cancer has actually benefited my life. Oddly enough, it starts with the NIH in 2015 actually released a report letting know to everybody that cancer rates had actually gone down, even though they're at an exceptional rate, as 50% of all men and women were likely to be diagnosed with cancer. And of that number, about 60% of that was considered terminal. So it was an unfortunate number considering that that was actually the lowest statistic that it has now eventually reached. Um, but a gentleman, Carl Pilmer, in 2013, actually, in contrast to this, conducted a research study talking to the elderly about the things that they regretted the most in their own lives. And it came to be that they regretted the fact that they had worried about the entire life throughout their life. So they worried about the outcome of their life in the end, um, which essentially amounts to the worrying amounted to nothing, but just kind of ruining everything. So I bring that up in the sense that cancer, worrying so much about it is kind of inconsequential. It's not going to solve anything. So that's the point that I've taken to this. It's the best way to look at having any sort of disease like this. Cancer has actually given me a stark realization of life. It has opened my eyes to appreciation of simplicity. It's worked out very nicely for just the way I see life overall. I've kind of abandoned the ideas of financial, like endless pursuit and materialism. It's just no longer really on my ideas of things to do because those are the things that are sort of culturally placed in our minds, the things that we need to do. Um, Basically, that just means that, in contrast to all kind of culture, it brings me to my next point, which is that overall, we pretty much overwork. We always do that. And these are my reasonable worries prior to actually being diagnosed with cancer. I constantly worried about my career path and where all my money was going to be coming in from, just like everybody else. Um, Essentially, in 2015, CNN actually reported that presidential candidate Jeb Bush was talking to a press in New Hampshire, it was, and he mentioned the idea that all Americans actually need to work more, essentially, to bring in more income to suffice their families. And that was an interesting contrast because even overall, we presided over all the worldly economic organizations. We already worked more than anybody. And even on top of that, Americans overall truly actually wanted to work more. We wanted to work more, about like 47 hours in a work week, which equates to about 6 days out of that entire week. So it kind of doesn't really make sense, but in a sense, I do the exact same thing simply because working that much, it sort of diverts attention from actually being poor. It makes you feel like you're not truly actually poor. CNN actually reported in 2015 the earnings for people that made literally the actual poor salary, essentially at about a yearly rate of 14,000, would spend about 25,000 in a year. So that equates to just shy of about 200% of their actual income. Middle class, you'd think perhaps is a little better, but they'd have an average rate of about 54,000 was the yearly income. But then they would actually turn that around by spending 90% of that, which brings them up to, I think it was the number was about 49,000 was in the year. Um, the other side of that is contrasted by the wealthy class, which they had the average rate of about 166,000 as their yearly income, but they would spend roughly about 100,000 of that, which is actually about 60%. So it sort of makes sense that the less money you make, you try as hard as you can to essentially diffuse the idea that you're actually poor. And you make a little bit extra money like that when you're in that wealthy class, you actually have a lot more money to spend for education and all the other things that would suffice your life. So those are the reasonable worries during that time that I actually did have. I did have my then reasonable worries of recovery following my brain surgeries. My very first one came around to be $93,000. And that was an incredible brain surgery to have. And it was in 2007 within our Great Recession. And I had no health insurance plan. So it was odd considering the idea that essentially like health insurance plans were offered to people that didn't need it. That's how the insurance plans made their money. And then if you actually did have something like cancer diagnosed to you, you could no longer actually get coverage. You had to be denied by basically everybody. So in getting that, at that point, I was within the Great Recession just like everybody else, but no money coming in, no idea how I was going to pay for any of this. So it was an unreasonable thing to have to try and consider because you have to do it regardless. Um, the operation itself was kind of tragic because it took about 15 hours, and then recovering that I could no longer read or write. So that was a weird thing to actually do and go through because it was damage to the left temporal of the brain. So it was odd then coming around to the idea of like figuring out all the things that were wrong with you because then you could actually have loss of memory, so you wouldn't actually truly know for a while. So it was weird, but I got through it, and then the reasonable worries I actually started to have after this in my recovery, that's where it actually started to get a little bit wild because that's when it was no longer exactly culturally acceptable because I started to see things a lot differently. And seeing things through those eyes when you have cancer and go through so many surgeries and radiation, you actually start to dislodge a lot of the ideas the culture has tossed in your mind as far as the things you have to do for happiness and appeasement. So I started to see things in a lot more of a simplicity. As a lot simple, a lot more simple of a happiness. So I started to appreciate the actual small motions in my body that I could still do. And even today, to this year, I still have to have numerous surgeries throughout my body. So I still continue to appreciate the ideas of simple movements. It's sort of like children newly learning the mobile functions that they can actually perform. It's sort of the same exact thing that I'm going through these days. So you see things a little bit more simplicity. Uh, each surgery that I had though was like it just became almost like a routine. You kind of had the idea of like, well, what's gonna then happen now? We're gonna carve into my head and start doing things. And so it was weird, but you start to see things a lot better each time you do it. You come out and you're actually better. Um, this essentially led into like the gruesome acts of cancer, but it transformed a lot of my life and actually let me see things a lot more clearly. It made me think a lot like the elderly research about not worrying so much about everything and actually putting faith into things that you do and you perform and people you're around. You appreciate a lot of the smaller things rather than dreaming about everything big because those are sort of like the unequatable dreams. Um, I started, just appreciating reading again, for the simple fact that I had to relearn how to do that. So I read a great deal more after those years. Um, I've just I've seen things a lot differently. I've learned in depth about the cancer that I have, and it's just more by looking at it clearly like that and not as a victim. You start to get the idea that sort of to master this situation. It's not going to go away. So you either lie back on the bed and you sort of take it, or you actually do suffice and master this and research it, understand it. Looking into this, I actually then found with my uh, health bill that I brought. This is the one that actually says there's my $93,000. And by looking into this, I actually found uh, the state fund. It was a CICP that actually was able to suffice for people that were poor. So it actually worked out really well because that entire 93,000 essentially went away. I thought that was going to be the thing that would just ruin my life. And then my surgeries after that, my several surgeries, actually we had to do the same thing. That inspired me to then look further in depth as far as treatments. And I found in research a little further into foundation medicine, and that was the genomic testing of mutations for cancer. And I actually found a great deal of information about that on the forefront of science these days, as far as all the things that they are doing, figuring out how to cure these things. So it was really interesting on the idea that I was able to look into this and research this and find all the answers I was truly looking for. Um, a lot of the impossibilities that I thought were impossible actually turned more so into possibilities. I looked into a lot of things. I started research. I started to read a great deal of things and find all the incredible answers that I really truly needed. Um, it's made me look at a lot of things a lot differently. As far as even like my schooling, I still decided to then start school, and I've been doing school for several years now, and it's turned into the fact that it's just I'm not too much further away from actually applying for a medical school. So that then makes me feel a lot better about the idea that I didn't just sort of victimize myself for this. I actually just continued on the path, looking into things and understanding what I needed to do next. Um, Essentially, I've just always considered more so about that preliminary research as far as what the elderly class in our society has said. I consider them the wisest because they've actually seen their years. They understand their lives. We're just trying to figure ours out. And they tell to not worry so much. It doesn't actually work. Worrying endlessly does not solve anything. So I've kept that to heart, and it's made me appreciate to great lengths the accomplishments that we can actually acquire and really pursue if you look at your life in simplicity and appreciate the little things that you do actually have. Because really, truly, in the end, we all face the exact same circumstance, which our lives eventually end. It happens to every single one of us. So it's just about what you do from the beginning to the end and what inspires you, what actually truly pushes you to do as much as you can rather than sit back and worry, just like the elderly have said. So I appreciate you guys letting me talk to you. Thank you very much.